Hi everyone, this is Rusty Sullivan, Executive Director of the Sports Museum with the latest episode of Curator's Corner. I am joined as always by Dick Johnson, our Curator of the Sports Museum. And Dick, I thought today we'd talk a little Bruins, if that's okay with you.
Please.
So 2018-19 has been a great season thus far for the Bruins, and obviously, you know, the meat of the season is ahead with the end of the regular season and the Stanley Cup playoffs. But I thought we would sort of talk about other recent years that have been great years for the Bruins, whether they resulted in winning the ultimate prize, the Stanley Cup, or not. And let's start with your era. What year in particular stands out there as sort of a memorable year, whether it be Stanley Cup winning or not?
Well, the memorable year was the year they lost to the Canadiens because that 1970-71 team established a record for goals that wasn't broken until years afterwards. They scored 399 regular season goals. Interestingly enough, the first Bruins game I ever went to in person was the only game they got shut out that year by the Blues, by their, the team they had beaten the year before.
Glenn Hall? Was it Glenn Hall? Or
Glenn Hall and Ernie Wakely combined. Anyway, and it was at home too. Anyway, but that team, that was such a monumental shock because the Canadiens that year were in complete disarray. They had fired coach Claude Ruel, had brought in a guy named Al McNeil, who was their minor league coach. There was all sorts of dissent on the team. I knew because I used to go to games in Montreal. My brother was in college up there, so I heard about all of this. They absolutely were not expected to proceed very far in the playoffs. In fact, they had not made the playoffs the year before.
But they had Dryden.
Who only played a handful of games at the end of the regular season, was very controversial because he had bumped off out of the picture a goalie from Montreal named Phil Meir. It's a big controversy. It was almost like the Nomar John Valentin mini controversy when Nomar came up. That didn't last too long either. Dryden and the Canadiens stoned us. I mean, it was shocking. So as great as those Orr Esposito era teams were, that team was the one that really stands out to me the most because of the jarring quality of that upset.
The 72 team is kind of forgotten, yet they won the Stanley Cup. And it's sort of ironic. I mean, obviously in 1970 you had Bobby Orr in the famous goal and breaking the long drought. 72, their playoff performance probably was even more impressive because they had to beat the Rangers in the finals.
They did, and at this point we were sort of taking them for granted. What we didn't really see, and we saw very soon thereafter, were the storm clouds of the WHA looming on the horizon, and the rather tight-fisted Adams family, who owned the team at that point. I mean, they had already allowed Harry Sinden to walk, which was bizarre because it was over not a very large sum of money, and they figured anyone could coach the team. Tom Johnson, of course, was the coach and was kept on after the 71 disaster. And they, of course, that 72 team, is that the greatest team in Bruins history? I think it may possibly be.
Really?
They were really good, yeah.
Any teams from the 80s stick out? I have a couple that I could throw out, but...
Well, I must say that 88 team was great,
yes,
and I was at the 7th game against New Jersey in the Garden, where you could only quantify the experience of being at that game by noise and heat. The building absolutely was vibrating. It was astonishing. I remember the goal Craig Janney scored, which was very much like the Bobby Orr goal in the finals, where Janney went flying through the air. It was really quite a game, and so getting to the finals that year, even though it was against a very heavily favored and loaded Oilers team, that was really a good team.
Well, to beat the Montreal Jinx after all those years, I mean, it was unbelievable. You know, we couldn't get past them, and then for us to win so convincingly with Lemlin, and you know, Cam Neely was emerging as an absolute superstar. Ray Bourque was at the height of his powers. That was a great team. Another great team from that era was '83, which people forget. That was the year of Pete Peters.
Yes.
And when the Bruins realized, I mean, they really rolled through the regular season. They had been down for a couple of years unexpectedly, still made the playoffs as they always did. But in '83, they sort of put it all together. It was Rick Middleton probably at the peak of his career with a young Ray Bourque, an older Brad Park, and everything came together. It didn't result in a Stanley Cup, but it was another memorable Bruins team.
Well, people forget the Bruins still hold the longest consecutive streak of playoff appearances in NHL history, even longer than the Canadians. It went on for years and years, so we sort of took for granted that the Bruins would be in the playoffs each year, and we dreaded, of course, many of the appearances against the Canadians. But the fact is that for sustained excellence, the Bruins really set a standard, and you give Harry Sinden a ton of credit, because as a GM, he was a great trader.
He sure was.
His drafts were either great or bad. When they were great, they were great. But his trades were really aside. They were Auerbach'ian at times.
Well, the Middleton trade was great, and obviously, the greatest trade in Bruins history was one that Milt Schmidt did with the Esposito Hodgson.
Right, but in second place would be the trade that resulted in the draft pick that resulted in Bork.
Well,
So, I believe that I'm trying to think of the goalie that involved, but it was a move of draft choices, and it ended up resulting in Ray Bork coming, who, one of the great draft choices in team history. Of course, we have a great draft choice now, and second rounder Patrice Bergeron, just basically skating his way to the Hall of Fame.
Oh, he's unbelievable.
And to the rafters.
Well,
too.
let's end with the 2011 team.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what strikes me about that team in retrospect. At the time, it was a magical run, and clearly you cannot discount what Tim Thomas did. But my God, that was a deep team. In retrospect, the lines that they would throw out, the third and fourth line, were just so good. They didn't have a superstar line along the lines of Esposito and Hodge and Cashman.
No.
But they just hit you with, and there was just quality guys across the board that Claude Julien was sending out on the ice.
Yeah, and you had a lot of hungry hearts on that team, and I would argue that the seventh game against Tampa Bay may have been the best pure playoff hockey game. Well, I would say in my own view, is the best pure playoff hockey game I'd ever seen, and that I've seen yet to this point. No penalties called in a game that went into overtime.
Unbelievable.
I mean, it was just the purest delight. And Tim Thomas had the greatest playoff any goalie in NHL history has ever had. I remember in the middle of that series, I bumped into, or in the middle of the finals, I bumped into Harry Sinden in the stairwell here, and I said, greatest playoff run by a goaltender, and he said, hands down.
Yeah.
And we both agreed that maybe second place would be Bernie Parent leading the Flyers, which he did 2 years in a row. But Thomas, because you have to win 16 games, and he won all 16 games.
It's unbelievable. And, Nathan Horton, and, but still, despite all that, Michael Ryder doesn't make that play in the Montreal thing. It shows you how luck is. I mean, they exit after the first round. It shows you how much luck is involved with the Stanley Cup. You have to be good, you have to be tough, and you have to be a little lucky too. And today,
it's why we love sports. Luck is so much a part of our daily lives. Would we have married who we did if we didn't go out on a blind date? Would we have done any number of different woulda, coulda, shoulda things? And sometimes just some little thing just breaks right and everything changes, and all for the good. And that was true here. That stop and that overtime in the seventh game against Montreal, which could have been a disaster.
yes,
Because it could have meant people being fired. It could have meant players being traded, any number of things.
overhauling the team.
Worked out right.
It sure did. So that's this episode of Curator's Corner. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Dick, and thank you.